Thank you, Michelle. And hello, everyone. Good morning from where I am. I'm joining you from Whadjuk country on Noongar land in Western Australia. And I guess I'd just like to start. I know that this is wonderful that we have this hybrid opportunity, but also invite you to take a moment to imagine yourself in the same time space continuum with both the people who are joining us online and the people who are actually in the room, be able to rub elbows with each other. And it's great to be part of a community of so many like-minded people. As we start in a moment, I'm going to get into introductions, but I just do want to acknowledge the ongoing and traditional custodians of the land that across this land that we now call Australia that we're all meeting on, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and into the future, and recognise what a privilege it is for me as someone who is from the Northern Hemisphere to have rediscovered a connection and be part of a country that has such a proud and enduring connection to Indigenous wisdom and culture, and it's a real privilege in my life. So in a moment, I am going to open to the rest of the group and give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. But just by way of sort of framing today's discussion, I have worked in the health system between the UK and Australia for a few years now. And in my work, I had identified that really the current economic model is one of the major contributors to some of the things that cause ill health. And I've sort of I think the universe had a hand in it, and it popped New Economy Network across my inbox a couple of years ago, and I had the chance to attend in Perth. And when I went to that conference, it was like, you know, a breath of fresh air and being able to reconnect with other people who shared that interest. But the question I had, because I came from a public servant background, was I wonder how this works in the public sector, or what the role of the public sector might be. And so I continue with those questions, because for me, I see the public sector, and I was just in a really interesting discussion led by Emily Sims about the tax mechanisms that we have in our country, but I do still see the public sector as a mechanism by which revenue comes from the community and then is delivered back to the community in the way of public services. And what I have observed is some of the tensions that I think exist. So for me, some of the questions that I'm knocking around, and I'm not expecting that we'll get to any answers, but how do we maintain, if indeed we want to, the foundations of the public sector approach, which are often understood to be fairness, transparency, accountability and consistency, but also have a public system that is responsive and agile and innovative and relational? How do we have agile, responsive public services, but also offer job security? We've heard a lot about, you know, the impact of financial insecurity on health. So how do we make sure that in becoming more agile, we don't lose the benefits of job security? What are the skills or mindsets that people in government or public sector roles might need to fulfill that adaptive, agile, innovative delivery of services? And how do we make sure that public services really accurately reflect and understand the communities that they serve, if that's at a local, state or national level? And I guess really sitting with, and I'm really interested over this weekend to see, do we think there is in fact a role for the public sector in a wellbeing economy, or is it a different paradigm? Is it something completely different? And I was really heartened in this morning's plenary session to hear that in fact tomorrow morning there is in fact another panel discussion which is going to be looking at new approaches, some government examples of people who are working in a different way, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that discussion. So that and I know too, another question that we discussed as a group was, how does the ethos of the public sector, you know, what drives the public sector, how does that relate to radical change? And given that that's a big part of what a health economy, a well-being economy would entail. Now, my background is I've worked in the UK and in Australia in health and social care systems, and my background is in change management and communications. And I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion here today with the people who are speaking on the panel, and also people who are joining us in the room and with the chat function. So I'll now ask the panel to introduce themselves, and as we talked about, if there's anything in particular about that framing that you want to respond to, or something else that you want to bring in, then please do. And Tarun, I'll come to you.
Good afternoon, Claire. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So I'm here on Whadjuk Noongar land as well, so I join my acknowledgement of country to Clare's. I'm a public health physician. I've worked most of my career in the public sector, in public health and public policy in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, and have been working as a consultant to government mainly for the last 3 years. I entered the public sector because I honestly believed that I could make a difference, and it was the greatest potential for me to enter an environment in which I could drive change. So there were opportunities to enter academia, but I really wanted to enter in the Northern Territory, the public sector, because I thought the possibility of making quicker change was right there. And I actually think that was a good decision for me anyway. And I've never lost my faith in the ability of the public sector to be part of a change process. I've never lost my enthusiasm for public sector innovation. And when I was head of public health in WA, I'd stand up and say, I am proud to be a public servant. And that would actually get some indraws of breath from other public servants, because people weren't used to, even senior ones, actually expressing a pride in the public service. And I just want to go to a quote which is from Don Watson's book, Recollections of a Bleeding Heart, which is his view of the Keating prime ministership. And this is about the public service. It says, the point of the public service is that it runs on public spirit, which it uses in place of the private sector's desperation and fear, hunger and greed. I'm not saying that's quite accurate, but that's what Don Watson said. He goes on to say, in addition to spirit, it needs intelligence, judgment, suppleness, freedom from cant, but it also needs drive, imagination, even an aesthetic. End of quote. And I've always loved that quote because it sums up to me that aesthetic nature. It actually can be an unbelievable place to work if you can find some like-minded colleagues and drive change and just kind of get on with it. And we were able to do that, I hope, in various things, public policy initiatives and public health initiatives in both the Territory and in Western Australia. I worked with Clare during that period and loved working with Clare because she is, again, one of those can-do people. I'd like to talk later on about how you can move that sense of purpose and sense of possibility into a wellness agenda, as well as just doing what the public sector is good at doing and needs to do, which is, always twofold, which is one, implement government policy, and secondly, advise on government policy. But particularly around that advice, you can really have some innovative options. But even in terms of the implementation, if you're closely enough connected to the ground, as you implement, you can use real world data, etc., and experience and stories to then further drive and improve public policy. So I might leave it at that. I know the others have got lots of interesting stuff to say too. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Tarun. Alison, come to you.
Okay, give me a sec. All right, well, kia ora, kaya, greetings all. My name is Alison and I'm a recovering public servant. Yes, albeit also a proud one for many of the achievements of the public service, but public service can also be quite a difficult place for people who are, shall we say, can do as you described, Tarun. I'm also an economist and originally from New Zealand, where I spent many years working in local and central government, and now have a consulting business working with local governments and communities on their vision and priorities to plan for their future. So my interest in this session is around the role of the public sector in empowering community leadership and creating local solutions to local challenges and opportunities, whether it be economically, socially, environmentally, and crucially, the links between those and the sustainability of those. And that role may simply be getting out of the way, or it might be providing practical support such as coordination, administration, facilities and funding, which are much more efficiently and effectively provided at a more centralised level. And it might be adapting local, state or federal services to be more responsive to local circumstances, needs and cultures. In a nutshell, how do we move away from the traditional top-down, we know best, service provider of first resort model as the default position. So I'm greatly looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Alison. And I'd love to get straight into this discussion already. I know we have it's going to be such a rich discussion. Thea, I'll come to you.
Thanks, Claire, and lovely to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which my feet are today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I work with an organisation called the Centre for Public Impact, and a lot of what Alison just mentioned is sort of pretty central to how we think about our vision for reimagining government as well. So what we do is we work with governments and people around government to reimagine government. And we use that language deliberately, which picks up on a thread from Don Watson's quote that Tarun mentioned as well. And what this reimagining requires is a shift away from seeing the role of government as to sort of control things and do things to people, to seeing the role of government as being about creating the conditions that enable people to live flourishing lives. And what that requires is a shift in both how government does its business, but also what government believes. You know, it sort of requires a shift at the level of values and principles. Often you see those iceberg diagrams and it's the stuff below the iceberg that needs to change. And what we work with governments to sort of encourage is for them to embrace complexity, to recognise the enormous importance of human relationships, and to reorient themselves away from a mindset of control towards a learning mindset. And I think that the connection to the wellbeing economy is that a lot of what government does now, so new public management is the sort of the term for how government organises itself, is a pretty direct mirror of a neoliberal economic paradigm. And the shift away to that, to a more human government, to a government that is more humble, to a government that thinks systemically, to a government that cedes power to communities and recognises that communities know best, needs a different economic paradigm that sort of walks alongside it. And I think that the economic paradigm that best suits a government that is able and sort of oriented around complexity and relationships and learning is a wellbeing economic paradigm. And so I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and to explore further from other speakers in our audience what this means and looks like in practice.
Thank you, Thea. And some themes I feel are starting to emerge already. Shelley, I'll come to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm coming to you from beautiful Jar Jar Wurrung country in central Victoria, and I wish to pay my respects for this beautiful land and being able to be upon it. I've got a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, and I'm in Victoria. So for 2 years, my son doing year 11 and year 12 has been out of school more than he's been in school. My daughter, for her formative year 8 and year 9, has been out of school even more than my 17-year-old son. And that's 2 critical years. I live in a community in which the last 14 weeks has experienced 2 of the most horrific storms on record, where we've seen the majority of our forest, the Wombat State Forest, ripped, like someone has walked through it, ripped massive old growth trees up and thrown them. The reason, that's just 2 examples of living in Victoria right now. The reason I raise it is because I think what is upon us now is a time to think community and local more than ever. And in fact, think about wellbeing communities as part of a wellbeing economy. What does that look like? What does that shape? My background has been many and varied. I too am an ex-public servant. For about 9 years, I was the Senior Public Health Advisor in Victoria. And yes, got out just about a year before the pandemic hit, thank goodness, could still focus on my true love, which is prevention and population health. You know, that concept of keeping the population healthy and well for as long as possible and in any way that we can. I had such an interesting experience as a public servant. It was that moment in time, or that window, I think that, and I hope many public servants get to experience, where you actually think, oh my goodness, we could actually make a difference. There was an alignment between local, state and federal governments, which is incredibly rare, and it was under a kind of big area in Australia called the National Partnership Agreement in Preventive Health. And it was just extraordinary and it was exciting. And
my response to Victoria was certainly to lead an agenda around innovation and reform and community. And I saw things I never thought were possible, and I felt them. The price of that is extraordinary. It's exhausting to lead change in the public service. And I still have the scars and the wounds from having done that. But I saw something that everybody said was impossible: how you shift governance, how you shift responsibility, how you actually move to local. And I think this is such a big part of the future. But then what happened, which will often be in the rhetoric of a public servant, will be then the government changed. So raising that point is really critical, because then the government changed. The government changes all the time at local, state and federal level. So how do we navigate and create a space that is outside of that system but connected to that system? I've tried to change within the system. I'm very keen to be outside the system and create a different type of market, particularly in my space, which is health and wellbeing. How can we create a more socially and health-oriented marketplace for health and wellbeing? So now I'm the CEO of Health Futures Australia. That's one part of my experiment. Set up a not-for-profit health promotion charity that leads really around, if we're going to move from current local systems not conducive to health and wellbeing, how might we transform to ones that have far greater impacts that are economic, social, health, and environmental. So multiple co-benefits. I think this is the future, and I think that for me, and there's a long list of things that I think I have great hope that the public service will embrace, because it's here now. There's no choice in my view. We are amidst the greatest complexity we've ever faced. The opportunity to truly innovate. And in particular, I think one real trigger point is in and around sustainable financing. How do we do it? What does it look like? How different? How do we incentivize so that someone like myself, who's now in a not-for-profit world, doesn't get project controlled to death, where I sit with 5 public servants in a actual project control meeting. Don't you love the language? So how do we free up the system, and what's each of our roles in that? To actually create a whole new space, I think, where we can truly innovate and experiment and deliver change. And I think it looks very different to where we are now. And I think the public service looks very different to where it is now. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Shelley, and thanks to all of you. I think we need a whole conference just on this topic. That would be my take. But there's just so many things there. There was a couple that stood out that seemed to go across everything that everyone said. I was really struck by the comment that some of you made about your own experience as a public servant, and that seemed to be about what that was like for you as a person leading change in a complex setting. And Shelley, you named it there about you said it's exhausting to lead change in a public service, and Alison, I can see you nodding too. And for me, that really is the crux of what we're talking about. If we are to move from and Tarun, I heard you talk about, what can be done from an innovative policy development point of view. But then as you try to implement that into practice, and for me, this also brings in that financial element. So I was a little bit involved in supporting the initial discussions around a NENA health hub. And one of the things that emerged really quickly was that if you have a system that is outside of the current publicly funded paradigm, then those models need to be funded somehow, and it often ends up being user pays. And so that immediately perhaps removes accessibility for people who may not be in a position where they can participate in healthcare on a user pays model. Like we've got all sorts of things that are MBS funded, but other things that there's just strong evidence for that are not yet, and so on. But I wonder then if we might start perhaps, and again I'll just open it up and let's see where it goes in terms of and Thea, it picked up on the theme that you had talked about the not just, what was it that you'd said, it's not just what government does, but it's what it believes. And for me, again, and I'm obviously bringing my lens to this, I see that actually come down to, it's not about this kind of inhuman behemoth of a public system. What it means is what the individual public servants believe, and how do we make it possible for people to really push the boundaries and do something when they're working against a prevailing system? So that was very long, but I'll open it up and see who wants to respond.
I might just have a first crack at that, Claire, because my experience of change on a fairly substantial scale in the New Zealand public service wasn't working against this. It was working against the prevailing system, but not against the prevailing sort of leadership and direction. So It was actually was actually totally supported and driven by the Prime Minister and ministers. And actually what we achieved in that period would not have been possible without that. I don't believe it would have been. I don't think we could have somehow done that all under the radar screen and affected such substantial institutional change. Then yeah, I mean, it was hard yakka because it was going against the prevailing kind of culture within the public service, but it certainly wasn't going against where the political leaders wanted to take it.
Yeah. And I sorry, go on.
So I think that's really helpful, that if you do have that senior leadership from ministry, or that's great. I will pick up on the issue though, if you don't have that, where can that leadership come from? And you talked about exhaustion, etc. And I would say that senior leaders in the public sector can actually be part of the change themselves by how they act. Now, clearly they need to find some colleagues, and I'm reminded of what Craig Tomler used to write about years ago. I'm not sure people know Craig, but about a decade ago, he wrote about a social public service. I think it was just a blog post, but I never forgot it. It was just talking about the way you have to be kind of socially inside the public service in terms of communication and collaboration or whatever, and sharing and generosity and all of that stuff, and how the public service needs to become more social. And okay, so the first thing is find a few colleagues you can work with, of course. But the second thing, which I really feel people don't do, is use their reputational capital. So I used to really challenge my colleagues to say, you're really senior now. You've built up these years and years of working in the public service. No one's going to fire you, okay? It's like you've got reputation in the bank. What are you going to use that reputation to drive in the years you've got left? What are you going to spend that capital on, basically? Because no point investing that capital, building it up and up and up, never using it for anything, because you retire and you get a nice tea party or whatever you get, but that's it. Capital dies with you. So I think that issue about risk and taking some risks and spending your reputational capital to back in younger people or newer ideas or whatever you want to do is one of the missing ingredients in the public service.
Yeah, I'll happily add to the conversation. I used to have a little kind of theory, and it was a saying I use almost every day, which is, it's much better to ask for forgiveness and permission, because in fact, I'd be told no all the time. And one of the first, I have a little kind of mental checklist, particularly when working closely with ministers. What's kind of, how far can I go? Like, how disobedient can I actually be? And checking off the little checklist. Have you got my back? Have you got my back? Because it's not always the case. We see it all too often. I've seen trails of senior public servants go. And I remember that moment I stepped into being a state public health advisor. I had this 24 hours of panic, like, oh my gosh, I'm the head on chopping board level now. And, it's kind of, I just put myself right out there. And, that was my fear. And, but I got over it pretty quick and quite relatively enjoyed the whole wild ride. But I think, I didn't ask for permission. I think, to change these systems, the level of disruption, if we actually are talking about changing the system, or are we, I'm not convinced that that's possible. I'm not sure that we actually don't need something completely new, and I'm not quite sure what that is. But I think the other reality, and the thing that really gets me, and part of my leading as a public service, was how do you keep building things? How do you keep building policy and then have to change it or stop it? And I think this is a fundamental problem. You change a government means change a policy direction. So how do we put these checks and measures in place as a system to enable us, particularly in public and population health? We need 5-10-year timeframes. Well, I'd argue for almost everything we do. How do we not see this chopping and changing every 3 to 4 to 5 years? I want more accountability on that. 10-year terms on politicians, for example. How do we actually change it or develop a new system that can be conducive to really good public policy and the longevity with which it needs to have impact?
I might just jump in quickly just to sort of offer an example of a place that I've actually seen work differently and do things differently, because I think sometimes part of what we do at CPI is try to shift from sort of the theoretical conversation to tangible examples of people working differently on the ground, because what you often hear is, you know, from politicians or you know, or senior public servants, but that's not possible. And we want to be able to say, yes, it is. Look here, look here, look here. So I think one example of a really, you know, a really sort of profound shift happened in a place called Wigan in the UK, led by a woman called Donna Hall, who is like fierce, you know, and dogged and a complete visionary. But what she did, which I think was so interesting, and you know, this is in a relatively small borough at local council level in the UK. So that is a significant caveat. But with the leadership, under the leadership of Donna, who persuaded the sort of the elected authorities as well, she decided that the way that the shift needed to happen to, you know, to create a more relational, complexity informed, all the ideas that we've been speaking about, form of government, was to actually start from how frontline workers, so police officers, social workers, everyone basically in the council, how they thought about things. And so she trained everyone, she got anthropologists in and trained everyone across the whole council, thousands of staff, in ethnographic methods, so that when they were thinking about things, when they were engaging with citizens, when they were asking questions, they were doing it with a completely different lens, you know, with a lens that was framed around ethnography and anthropology, rather than sort of, you know, economic sort of, rather than from an economic basis. And the story, it's the Wigan deal. I'll find it after I've finished talking. I'll drop it in the chat, because the sort of the results of Donna's vision have been profound, both in terms of the economic benefits of the approach that she's taken through the Wigan deal, and in terms of the social cohesion across the whole Wigan community. So I think, again, you know, there are examples of public servants who from the top have had a vision, and through changing the approach and the mindset of all of those working as part of the system, have actually managed to achieve quite significant transformation in both sort of traditional terms, you know, the dollars stack up, and also in terms of the social fabric of the sort of Wigan community as well.
Can I ask a question?
Mm.
It's mainly, I think it's back to Thea, because you said something in your first set of comments around the new economic paradigm. It made me think, well, maybe it's not just economics, you need a new social paradigm to go with a new economic paradigm. And something you then said about Wigan, which says, you know, how does ethnography, you know, link into change? You know, it's about thinking beyond, you know, the economics or something. Is that right?
I think that's right. And I think, again, to sort of point to an example of what that looks like, you know, I think, and Alison, you're probably the most familiar with this of all of us, but the Living Standards Framework, which the New Zealand government has introduced, is a really powerful example of, again, you know, thinking holistically. The role of government, the role of Treasury, is not just to make sure that the dollars are adding up. It's actually to make sure that the decisions that are being made through budget are cognizant of the environmental implications, the social implications, the human implications, you know, all the different layers. So I think you're right, Tarun. And really, when you talk about paradigm shift, I guess that's what it is, isn't it? It's not just one thing changing. It's the whole sort of system shifting, which includes economy, government, you know, society. All of those things have to shift in sort of concert with one another.
Thank you. We have someone from the participating who, Stephen, I'll come to you on the chat, or in the if you've got a question.
Yeah, so I'd like the panel's thoughts on a tension that I've always thought of in terms of this relationship between government and governance, and the extent to which we forfeit our power as communities to a separate centralised entity called government, and then require public servants to kind of look after us. And to what extent, and I don't see this as a binary choice, it's either big government or local communities looking after themselves, but how do we devolve power to communities? How do we empower people to govern themselves at the community scale? And one way I'd like to look at this is in terms of, like, health is a service provision, but we have no problem. So we see that as a government responsibility, but food systems we see as a free market responsibility. And if we had at community scale some level of control of our food system, then there would be a level of self-governance and an alleviation of a whole lot of health problems if we had fresh organic food in a walkable environment near where we lived. Just some of your thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And just before I open it up to the group to respond in the way they want, I can see another hand or so up. If you want to put your questions in the chat so that we can see what's coming through, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in about 10 minutes. So who would like to respond there to Stephen's question?
I'm happy to just say something very basic, which I think Stephen, very beautifully put the dilemma there of government versus governance. I think everyone understands that government of various levels have limited roles. So I do think it's different for local government versus state government versus federal government, and local government clearly has a stronger connection in and closer to the community. But whatever, there will be a limit to which the government can reach the community. And that's why we have civil society organisations, which clearly have their roots much closer into the community. So if we accept that there's a limit for what government can reasonably achieve, then it's a matter of, on the one hand, making sure that government funds civil society organisations to bridge that gap and explicitly invokes their relationships. And I think it's hugely valuable. And I saw that in Victoria last year in the COVID response, where government simply couldn't reach the people in the lockdown towers, for example. And you need established community organisations, and there were organisations like Co-Health who had been, already established and could do that. And government was never going to be able to achieve its objectives without funding Co-Health to do certain things on its behalf. So that's one thing which I think is good value, we need to dial that up. And what we need to dial down is government, funding big four accounting firms to come in and give ridiculously non-valuable, poor value advice to fill the role of government because it's shrunk. So, you see again that with COVID, not just in Australia, but across the developed world, massive amounts of money simply wasted to private sector consulting firms, which I think is just shameful.
It's such a good question, Stephen, and I've come full circle, and I'm going back around the circle on this one. Less government, food is a solution, right? It is so much a part of what we can centre on, the way we grow it, the way we prepare it, the way we eat it. And I think I link that through to kind of wellbeing community concept, how we create, healthy circular economies for food locally, and can that create these kind of new local economies? And I deliberately, in my first 18 months out of government, said I'm not having anything to do with government, for all those reasons. Can't be project controlled otherwise, and really discovered how hard that was. And I'd come from a strong background in government and had a lot of networks, and every time I was trying to do something, I was asked, do the government support what you're doing, Shelley? And, initially my responses were pretty blunt to that, but then I kind of learned, wait, this is about endorsement. This is interesting and somewhat scary that you can't create this innovation space without getting some sort of endorsement of government. So I've kind of moved around the circle now, saying, what relationship would I have with government? I've looked at social impact bonds. I don't think they're particularly useful. A whole range of mechanisms haven't come to a solution yet, but I'm trying a whole other angle now around kind of different types of food system models and how can we generate different types of income. Social enterprise, for example, but building that out a little bit more. So I think it's a somewhat hybrid model, but I think it's a really different role. And I have this constant dance with government around that, both local and state. What is your role in this? In fact, how might you actually enable these local food systems to thrive without having to control them? But I think there's enormous opportunity there. But I think government's role in this is very different to the role it's had previously. It's more of a seed initiator of innovation. And then let it thrive and don't stop it.
Thanks. I wonder, I might come to Alison if that's okay, because I know that she was going to jump in just before.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Dave, I totally get what you're saying around the difference between government and governance, especially from my perspective at the local level. That is a big shift in, it's a tectonic shift in local government to move to a local governance approach, and it's still just kind of fragile. But I've posted in the chat a link to Inspiring Communities in New Zealand, which is kind of the closest New Zealand has to a sort of peak body for community-led development. And there's a lot of resources there about what communities are doing and how the public sector is supporting that leadership. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to have a look at that. I think there's some great examples there.
Thanks, Alison. Sorry about that, Thea.
No problem. I was just going to pick up directly on that, the analogy that Shelley used. And Dave, it's actually from that author, Hilary Cottam, that I mentioned. She speaks about government as head gardener, Shelley. And she says shifting away from sort of controlling the mechanical levers to planting, tending, nurturing, and where necessary, weeding. And I think that's such a beautiful analogy for what government might be.
Dave, I'll come to you in just a second. And as a couple of responses I just wanted to make to what's been said. One is, I now work at Health Consumers Council in Western Australia, and that's an organisation that tries to promote and support lived experience voices in health services and health systems. And I'm really encouraged by hearing the possibilities. And that's why I work in the sector I work in. I believe the next wave of transformation is going to be community-led, and I think we need a different set of skills, I think, for many public servants to be open to, first of all, going out with a question before you know the answer, because as an ex-public servant, going out and then potentially being criticised for, well, you haven't thought this through, was actually something I felt quite deeply. Whereas from this side, I now see, don't wait till it's done before you speak to people, get people's input much earlier, how we can create the systems that make that possible. And so the second thought will come back to me in just a moment. But in the meantime, Dave, I will come to you with your question.
Oh, yes. I'm old enough to have benefited from the kind of post-war welfare reforms and in health, education, housing, transport, across the piece. And in many ways, it was a well-being economy for a very short period of time, certainly compared to my parents' experience in the 20s and 30s. And I think Thea touched on the neoliberal contamination of that, if you like, and the introduction of market principles into the public service, and almost by sleight of hand, the privatization of key services, etc. And given the central role that all government performs in the delivery of what we now call the foundational economy of health, housing, education, social care, elder care, etc. How do we get back to that kind of principle where government cares for its citizens, it takes responsibilities for them, it doesn't see them as market consumers, it sees them as citizens and with a responsibility. And I firmly believe that has to be in partnership with civil society and in an equal partnership. And if we go back to some of those structures, in that post-1945, they had elected representatives, they had boards, public boards, they were public institutions in the truest sense. And I just wonder how we, can we go to a similar model, or can we recapture some of the spirit of that model and perhaps move government much closer to a well-being delivery model?
Thanks, Dave. If there is anyone else who'd like to respond to that while you're waiting for that, I'll just say that as Thea suggested, one of the things I took away from the Radical Help book is at the start of it, Hilary Cottam kind of unpicks, if you like, how we got to the situation that we're in, and sort of gives a really good analysis of, if you like, some of the sort of incorrect founding assumptions that might have been put in place in the UK when the welfare state was first established, and or an assumption that was correct but has been misinterpreted as it's developed. So the incorrect assumption, first of all, and it goes, we had this discussion in the previous session about the tax system, was that there would always be, and it is a gender thing, there would always be women who would be available to look after children, and they would be able to look after older family members. And the second one was, though, that my understanding is that the original intention was never that the state would do everything, but rather that the state, like you talked about there, Dave, a real partnership between civic society, families, communities, and social services or public services. And instead, she describes very well about moving where it's kind of like, you know, people go in and say, you know, don't make eye contact, and they just go, so have you done this? Have you done that? It's all about risk assessment rather than the relational provision of services. And I'm really looking forward to her next work. I heard her speak at a conference, and she's now starting to look at the relationship that we have between caring responsibilities and our work responsibilities, and how often the way she framed it was that we seem to tuck our caring responsibilities in around our work ones. I think it's going to be really interesting. But sorry, Shelley, I realised afterwards that you had in fact unmuted, and perhaps we're going to respond.
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I've just gone through this fascinating process in the Shire that I live in, Hepburn Shire in Central Victoria, and a real flipping over of how to engage citizens in, you know, in the design really of the future. And it's been quite fascinating. A deliberative dialogue, citizens panels, a whole bunch of other processes, which I think have great promise. But then what tends to happen is those processes, the outcomes of that then go back into the system, rather than create necessarily, you know, that seismic shift that someone like me puts my hand up and go, all those panels do. You know, so it's kind of that classic thing, how do we break out of the system to really deeply listen to what's being said and what communities want to do, because it actually means something very new. And, you know, and I was kind of just sitting there with my head in my hand saying, gosh, you know, the community's given permission that, you know, let's walk together on doing some really amazing stuff, but yet it just has to go back into the planning format, you know, and I personally think that planning is killing us. And, you know, we keep doing it. And if in doubt, do a plan. And so, yeah, I think, you know, deliberative and deep engagement, but then what do you do with it? You know, I think it's the follow through, and does that lead us down a different path? Well, of course it does, but are we brave and are we ready to steward that path? And that stewardship role to me is a big part, a big role of government.
What Dave said is just, I think it's a reminder to us that when we're talking about a wellbeing economy, we have to be really make sure that we don't just talk about a wellbeing economy for the middle classes who have already got their basic needs of life fulfilled. You know, what Dave was saying was the basics of the welfare state still don't reach to everybody. So, you know, it's like the fundamentals of what government has to do, we have to guarantee as you know, human rights, essentially. And there's many groups in society where those fundamentals don't reach. So at the same time as we meet that, we also then have to have a discussion about what more we can do. But it's a bit like local government, you know, I'm not an expert in local government, you know, it's way more than, you know, roads, rates and rubbish, whatever it's called, you know, whatever that trifecta is. But unless you do collect the rubbish, you know, there are certain communities where local government services don't, you know, collect the rubbish, etc. And you need to do that plus all the other things that local governments do. And so similarly at a national government level, we need to guarantee people's fundamental rights in a welfare state, as well as do more than that. So I think it's a nice reminder from Dave about the fundamentals of what government does have to do every day for people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But also, I just want to acknowledge the link between the last two questions. And I think I got the names mixed up before, but it was Stephen, I think, was asking about governance. Is that right? I think this is really related to that. And one of the things that's happening at a local level that I observe all the time is that with the declining trust and increasing almost hostility between different sort of, I don't know, factions in the community around the views of the role of local government. So there's a sort of a sizable group of people in the community who believe that local government exists to rip them off and you know, take their rates and spend it on things that don't matter. And sometimes even to the extent that they'll accuse them of more or less kind of feathering their own nest in some way, you know, through inflated wages and inflated staff sizes and that sort of thing. And this is killing some of our local communities, can I say. So the idea of governance as opposed to government is what is driving local government back into the, you know, traditional government sort of as it's trying to defend itself almost, and away from that partnering and governance role of collaboration at a community level. And I honestly think, to both Dave and Stephen, this is one of the critical things that we have to crack if we're going to move forward in this area, is actually the perception of the role of local government and how communities and local governments can work together successfully. Because I tell you, that's going backwards at the moment in my observation.
Thanks very much. Now, at this point, this is where I think, like, okay, so we're starting to put together a bit of a programme for our 3-day conference on the role of government and a wellbeing economy, but that could just be me, because I'm afraid we're getting very close to our time. I know we started a wee bit late, but I know that there will be another session starting in about 6 minutes. So I'm going to move now towards wrapping up, and I'll come to each of the speakers who have already, you know, really blown my mind in terms of things to think about and ideas, and just see if there's either one final comment based on your reflections from the discussion today or anything else that you want to leave this discussion with. I might do it in the reverse order from last time, maybe. So Shelley, I'll come to you.
Yeah, you know, I'd love to see some sort of, you know, citizen-led entities, maybe a good thing or not, you know, linked closely with media, that kind of, you know, helps to do the reflective setting of the agenda. Because I just kind of feel, you know, how do we, where's the mirror that we can hold to public policy and the decisions? And you know, and I think to see that, particularly for my work at community level, would be really quite exciting. Like, I want more conversation. I want more inquiry into how money is spent. I want to see more accountability, and I want to see more innovation, and most importantly, I want to see impact. And I think that, you know, if we can't get to that in the current public service model, we have to, with speed, experiment with other models. And yeah, I think that would be something. And you know, my final thing is, you know, just, you know, disobedience with empathy.
Thanks, Shelley. Thea, I'll come to you.
Thanks. I mean, this has been such a rich conversation, and there's, yeah, as Claire said, there's so much more that we could explore and say. Shelley, a lot of public servants I speak to also use the term proceed until apprehended, which is a similar sort of idea. I guess I'd just sort of end with, I thought it might be worthwhile sort of sharing our theory of change at CPI, you know, how because this is a massive, massive conversation and a massive challenge to reimagine government. And you know, I mean, we've all touched on that today, but the way we sort of go about it is we draw on, there's an author called Donella Meadows who's written a book called Thinking in Systems. And the way she talks about shifting paradigms is you point out the anomalies of the current system, and then you point loudly and with assurance to what the alternative might look like. And then you build a coalition of the willing around the people who identify those same anomalies and are pioneering the possibility of what difference looks like. And you build your coalition, and you don't waste time with reactionaries. So you don't spend time finding the people in government who say this is not possible, this is a waste of time. You find the champions and you focus your energy there. And then eventually, you know, over the course of a decade or two, things start to shift and the reactionaries become less. So I think that I just wanted to share that, because whenever I start to sort of feel a sense of despair around what we're doing, I remind myself about that theory of change, and it makes everything that we can all do at the sort of micro scale feel like it's contributing to a bigger movement and a bigger sense of change.
Thank you, Thea. There's just so much richness here. I can see, so much to take away. Alison, I'll come to you.
I literally could not add to what Thea said. I'm completely on the same page. So well said, Thea.
Thanks, Alison. And Tarun.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, everyone. So just to go back what Shelley said, you know, transparency and accountability, that's what I spend most of my time just really focusing on. And you can't have enough transparency and accountability. And that in itself allows for a whole lot of other things to happen. But to go back to where I started about aesthetics, I mean, one of the things about aesthetics, you know, beautiful public policy, good government, is that it's beautiful, makes you feel good. So the question I'd leave us with is, how should it feel like inside the public service? How should it feel to do good government inside the public service? It should give you a positive, you know, something. It should feel like something. And secondly, how should government feel to those who are interacting with government if it's done well? And I think we forget, you know, how awful government can feel from the outside as well. And that's bad government if it feels bad. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tarun. I will, in terms of me trying to think about one thing, I think what I've heard really strongly about the voice of lived experience and the voice of communities in partnership with the current structures. I've also heard about the possibilities of using leadership capital and how people can be supported to do that. And overall, I've heard something about trust, maintaining trust in oneself, the systems and the communities. I've got so much reading to do to go away. I would just like to give an enormous thanks to people who came forward to be part of this. This is a topic that is just a real fascinating thing for me, and to be able to be part of this. And a huge thank you to NENA for creating the space where we can have these kind of conversations. So thank you all, Alison, Thea, Shelley and Tarun, and thank you, Michelle and the NENA team. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And before you all jump off, I just want to say personally how much I've enjoyed this session. I have been in here in the background, and I'd really like to invite you all to join us next year for a specific webinar or workshop on this topic. I've been really, really keen to connect NENA more fully to government discussions and discussions about the culture of how we all work together. And I think this is a really perfect way to segue into that next year. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And we're actually having a break now. So if you'd like to all just jump off Zoom, I strongly urge you, run outside and get some sunshine. I know I need to. And at 3:30, all the parallel sessions will be live again. Fingers crossed the technology issues are now smoothing themselves out. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much, Claire, for chairing and making this a really fantastic session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.